Welcome to the show. Today we have Samuel Parkison. He is the Associate Professor of Theological Studies at Gulf Theological Seminary in the United Arab Emirates. So he's overseas and he's teaching and doing a lot of cool stuff out there. Got his PhD from Midwestern Seminary, and we're just excited to have him on the show to talk about a great article he wrote on baptizing children. So Samuel, thank you for coming on the show. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
So we were talking a little bit off camera or off the mic about credo baptism, Protestant retrieval, and that whole deal. And I've had a couple guests on where we've talked about Protestant retrieval, and a lot of them have been Baptists, which some people scratch their heads at that, and which is why I want to have these kinds of interviews, because whenever you talk about Protestant retrieval and you're a Baptist, you have to contend with the fact that credo baptism has not been the majority practice throughout the church, throughout church's history. And all the reformers we look at would be like, why aren't you baptizing babies? And so that's a genuine historical issue that we have to contend with. And have had a lot of good conversation with that. But what struck me about what you wrote about the case for baptizing children is that I think it kind of scratches the itch for a lot of people who might find paedobaptism persuasive for a multitude of reasons. But it's a very interesting article. You're making the case on why we shouldn't delay baptism unduly, and that would mean baptizing children, which is funny because when we say we don't practice, it's not necessarily adult baptism we practice. It's credo, it's credible profession of faith baptism, which doesn't necessarily preclude children. And so I'm curious, just biographically, what got you inspired to write this article? What's kind of the background behind it?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I'm glad you gave that final qualifier, because that is a pretty important qualifier. I put it in parentheses in the title of the article, but the case is not just for strictly baptizing children; it's for baptizing believing children, and so really just kind of honing in on this idea of baptism after a credible profession of faith, or baptism after regeneration. Somebody's born again. Bound by the Spirit or baptized by the Spirit into the body of Christ universal. And so therefore a local church kind of recognizing that and baptizing them into the church. And I would say baptizing them into church membership would be a good, a good implication of, biblical teaching by good and necessary consequence. But yeah, what basically occasioned the article was the fact that that is my position, and I have found I've been frustrated by the lack of representation of my position in some conversations about Baptist practice and polity and that sort of thing. And so it was born out of a pastoral burden. So before I came here to the UAE to teach theology, I was a pastor at a local church in Kansas City for about 5 years. And so we had to develop a policy for our church with how, what we did with the conversion of children who are still under the parental authority of their parents, basically developing a policy for what does this actually look like for us to not unsay anything that we've said so far as a church about meaningful church membership and the relationship between baptism and the Lord's Supper and church membership. We want to be able to say all of these things, but we also have a category, as a group of pastors for baptizing kids that are still under the parental authority of their parents. So we had to develop, kind of a policy. What does this actually look like for us as a church? We have the big principles that are agreed upon and consistent and all of those things. But what do those principles look like at the local level? So we, this was years ago. We kind of sorted through this as an elder team and presented it to the church and all of those things. But since then, I have found that my position is a minority in the kind of circles that I swim in, namely Baptist circles that want to strive for meaningful church membership. So you won't find it difficult to find a lot of Baptist or non-denominational Baptistic churches that will baptize children. That's not difficult to find. But very often, those churches that are baptizing children are not churches that you think of when you think of things like meaningful church membership. Uh, a very um, I don't know, a careful, kind of thoughtful process of bringing somebody into church membership, recognizing their responsibilities as those that are entrusted with the keys of the kingdom by Jesus to bind and loosen on earth that which is bound and loosened in heaven. A church that practices church discipline, that sort of thing. Most of the time, you have churches that believe in. I mean, this is my own experience, but in my own experience has been churches that believe in meaningful church membership in that way that I just described it, or Baptistic churches that baptize children, and they're not very often the same thing. So because of that, I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about um, who should be the proper subjects of baptism and whether or not children who are still under the parental authority of their parents, whether or not they should be baptized, my own position was going underrepresented. So it was birthed out of basically frustration and being annoyed by the fact that I had to, I was just repeating all of the same arguments over and over again. And I just thought, it'd be convenient if I just had my own position neatly laid out in one location that I could just send to curious, to the curious that want to know sort of what is maybe a thoughtful, convictional Baptistic argument for not delaying baptism until young adulthood or adulthood or something like that.
We're going to put a link to your Substack articles. I think it's a very well written article, and in it you defend your Baptist bona fides. You're talking about you really have a strong sense of the Baptist ecclesiology. I mean, and you mentioned that earlier, and I thought that was a good point. Where typically you could have a church where we'll baptize an 8-year-old, but it's not explicitly tied to membership per se.
Right.
Meaning that now they become a member who can decide as part of the congregation who else becomes a member and who is excommunicated and essentially functioning with the keys, so to speak, in a congregational polity. And so that is interesting. You are in kind of a narrow space because you are adopting a practice that would typically be associated with a more non-denom kind of perhaps even megachurch type deal. I mean, then, but still trying to maintain a very robust sense of the Baptist polity. Now, you mentioned delaying baptism, and I think that phrasing is very key because typically baptism is phrased as not being preemptive. You don't want to be presumptive. But then flipping it and saying, well, is there a danger of delaying baptism, delaying what should be done now, is a very interesting way to frame it. So what are some reasons why within Baptist culture, perhaps even in American culture, there is this pull to delay baptism?
Yeah. Well, I in the article, I try to give some reasons for why you probably should delay baptism, to try to steelman the other position. And I would say, so at some point in the article, I list them out. One of the reasons is that delaying baptism is the historic Baptist practice. So when you look back at the, 17th century Baptist in England and then in America, because of rigorous kind of record keeping, you can see the average age of, new converts being baptized into the church. And, for many of them, it's like they're in their 20s and 30s and that sort of thing. And so, so I would say that, in general, in the early sort of, burgeoning process of the Baptist in that post-Reformational context, they were baptizing adults. Now, it's worth mentioning that they're coming from a context where basically people are becoming Baptist out of a Anglican or more established Paedo-Baptist kind of context. And so it really is, you're joining this church out of conviction. You've probably already been baptized as an infant into the Anglican church or a congregational church
Hmm.
maybe. And so now we're becoming more Baptistic convictionally. And so it makes more
You've
sense to
probably
kind of
been
say,
confirmed as well.
right, yes. And so a lot of these things are basically uh, for that kind of first couple of generation of Baptists, what you have are people who are becoming convictional Baptists as adults. And so it makes sense that you're going to see a lot of adult baptisms in that context. But that's one reason. A second reason would be delaying baptism seems to be the practice of the early church. First couple of centuries of the church, baptism is often kind of coming at a result of or after a lengthy process of catechesis. Although I'm not entirely confident on that one that they're all adults as well. I think that it's quite possible that young adults, like children in their teens or preteens, were able to go through that process as well. We just don't have a lot of information there. But it was after a lengthy process of catechesis, up to 2 years in some cases. But then, in terms of like the theological arguments, the next one would be delaying baptism as a safeguard against prematurely giving the signs and seals of the new covenant to individuals who are not, in fact, bound in heaven. And this is important because, first of all, there is the danger of giving false assurance to an unbeliever. You don't want to do that. That's why you have a process. That's why Baptists believe that it's important that we're only baptizing regenerate Christians. And because of that, we want to interview people that want to be baptized. We want to make sure that they have, in fact, experienced regeneration. And so if you just give this sacrament of baptism to somebody that's not, in fact, Christian, you're not doing them any favors by giving them the false assurance of being a believer if in fact they're not. You also have the danger of bringing in false converts into covenant membership, and that's that's something that Baptist ecclesiology, Baptist polity, uh, intrinsically tries to avoid. I would say more than other polity structures. We want to avoid false conversions. That's in part what church discipline is trying to do is weeding out false conversions. You also have the danger of preparing a person for the unfortunate scenario that I faced very, very often as a pastor, which is somebody is baptized as as a kid into a church and not really discipled in their baptism. And so maybe they were a Christian, but maybe they weren't. And they go through, a period later on in life where they're unsure if when I was awakened to the fullness of the gospel as an 18-year-old or as a 19-year-old, I'm not sure if that was conversion or if that was a gospel wakefulness, kind of moment. So therefore, I don't know if my
Right.
first baptism as a 5-year-old, I don't know if that was legitimate or not. So I faced it when I was a pastor. I did interviews for incoming members. That was routinely a stressor for incoming members, where they were like, I don't know if I was legitimately baptized as a believer or not. Um, so the way that baptizing believing children in credo Baptist context very often is practiced doesn't actually set people up for a uh, confident kind of future where they can look back on their baptism with any sort of confidence. And so because of that, um, the a church may say, let's just wait. What's the harm in waiting? That's another reason for delaying baptism is the argument that, ostensibly the risk of prematurely baptizing somebody are greater than delaying baptism for somebody that is in fact a Christian, because they can just continue up in the process of being discipled in their home and in the context of a local church, a loving community, that sort of thing. So what's the rush, basically? And then lastly, and this is the one that I have a lot of sympathy for. Well, two more reasons. this one I have a lot of sympathy for, and it is basically it. You could argue that delaying baptism, not giving baptism to kids that are, let's just say younger than 14 years old, as an arbitrary, kind of line in the sand. You could argue that delaying baptism for kids that fall under that threshold well accounts for the church's responsibility to bind on earth those who are bound in heaven. And I'm getting this from Matthew 16, Matthew 18, this passage and the Gospels about the keys to the kingdom that Jesus entrusts to the church, the keys to the kingdom of heaven, to bind and loosen on earth that which has been bound and loosened in heaven by the Spirit. This is one of the key Baptist polity arguments for believers' baptism, that it's the whole church that's responsible for bringing in somebody into church membership. And so because it falls on the whole church to make that kind of decision, the whole church needs to be able to be confident in the credibility of the profession of faith of the people that they're bringing into church membership through baptism. And, you could argue that many churches, even most churches, are not going to be able to verify the credibility of the profession of faith of an 8-year-old in their congregation as they would be if 15 or 16 or 17 or something like that. So here's a new one that I didn't mention in the article, but one that I do find compelling. I have a response to it that I'll share in a minute, but I think it's worth just kind of getting out there. And this is the argument from natural theology. Maybe you could put it like that. So it'd be something like, we recognize, given natural theology, that children have a different kind of constitution as adults. And this is signaled to not just in church practice, but in societal practice. We recognize that there's a difference between a kid can break the law, for example, but we have different kinds of different kinds of the infraction of breaking the law elicits different kinds of punishment if you're a minor as opposed to an adult. Or kid, you have to reach a certain age before you're allowed to get a driver's license, or drink alcohol, or be conscripted into the military, or vote, or something like that. And the argument is something like, it's good and right for us to have those kinds of thresholds, because we recognize, given what you can read from nature and general revelation, that the psychology of kids is underdeveloped until they reach a certain age. And so given the constitution of a kid, it makes sense that they are not being brought into the kinds of responsibilities that we associate with adulthood and that kind of thing. And so, in light of that, you might make the argument that perhaps God is creating a situation, or intends for there to be a situation for kids, and even believing kids, to be protected from the burden of responsibilities in a local church until they reach a certain age. And up until that point, the majority of their discipleship and the majority of their training and responsibilities is happening within the context of the home, with the mother and the father kind of discipling them into Christ-likeness. And so in that sort of scenario, doing something like joining a church, being baptized into a local church, is something like coming up from under the authority of your parents and entering into a new phase of life. It's analogous to something like you grow up, you graduate high school, you graduate college, you move out, and then you have your own job, you have your own car and car insurance. You got to pay for car insurance and health insurance and your job, and you pay for your apartment, and all of those things, because you're basically entering into a new phase of life, leaving the confines of the safety of a home, and then you're kind of creating your own home. And so
Right.
the analogy would be something like, if we recognize that there are certain responsibilities that you don't enter into until you reach a certain threshold in nature, why would we expect that to not be the case also in the church? And the argument is that
Right.
the responsibilities of church membership are more analogous to, or are analogous in this way to something like the responsibility to vote or be conscripted in the military or something like that.
See that mentality, that part I don't understand, and this is what's interesting. That it seems like many people who grow up Baptist or Credo Baptist, and they feel the pull of paedobaptism, whether it's Presbyterian or Anglican, is that they get this sense of that's a very modern kind of individualistic conception.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that you use natural theology, because I often hear paedobaptists argue from natural theology in this way. They would say that the home is the birthplace of faith.
Yeah.
And that and I think there's one big move I've seen. And it is that, usually a family, they grow up Baptist, they grow up non-denominational, whatever, Credo Baptist, they have a child. And beyond just the emotional feels of like, oh, I want them to be a Christian, all that stuff, is they start to realize that God has naturally designed the home to be the birthplace of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And they realize that I think there's a shift there where the household becomes a category, and then they start to think, well, we're thinking more corporately as a unit. Why can't that extend to the church? And then I think baptism shifts from being a subjective proclamation of individual's faith to membership within the community of faith, which is the sphere in which regeneration is born. I think that's a big shift that people draw from just the natural intuitions people have of, if you're a child and you're in a family and we're all Christians, everyone wants their kid to have a boring testimony.
Yeah.
And this gets into some of your arguments for child baptism, baptizing believing children,
Mm-hmm.
where you talk about not depriving them of the means of grace, which I thought was very, very interesting. And so I'm just curious. I'm just going to open up with that. I'm just curious if you want to elaborate on that particular concern.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me just say, first of all, from that sort of the natural theology kind of perspective, I also, I share with you your basically, lack of confidence in that, that argument, because for me, I'm not seeing in scripture, a competition between these two legitimately recognized spheres of fostering a faith. That is the sphere of the home, the Christian home, and then the Christian church. I don't see these things in competition with one another. So there's nothing for me that says, uh, by entering into the responsibilities of church membership and joining the family of the community of faith, you are leaving the responsibilities associated with being and the nurturing context of being in your family, your Christian family. So I don't see these things as competing. I readily recognize the legitimacy of the uniqueness of the Christian home. And yeah, to be honest, I do think that should go a long way in kind of recognizing God's providence, that he uses means to bring about the salvation of his elect. And I think you can just kind of note historically that one of God's favorite means to bring about the conversion of his elect is the faithful discipleship and evangelism of godly parents. And so, I put a lot of stock in that. I kind of recognize God gave my kids to me and my wife. He's placed my kids into my household where they're going to be saturated with the gospel. They're going to hear about it. We're going to read the Bible as far as I can help it every day. We're going to pray together every day. They're going to be inundated with the gospel. And so I do put a lot of stock in that. Not absolute stock, right? Because the Spirit is free, as Jesus talks about in John 3. But yeah. So to get back to the specific question you asked, the burden of my kind of my burden in this whole conversation is not to directly contradict any of the good reasons that you might have for delaying baptism. And further, even before I say anything else, I can imagine being a pastor and inheriting a church situation where it is not anywhere near the high point of my priorities to start getting the church to start baptizing their believing children in their midst. I think that ideally, in that sort of scenario, you'd like for the church to be very mature and to have these categories kind of correct and to be discipled by the pastoral leadership into what baptism is and how it should function. And so I'm not even necessarily saying I wish all Baptist churches would start to baptize believing children. But I simply wish to say, okay, not disagreeing with any of the good reasons you may have for delaying baptism. And I recognize those
Right.
are good. Those are all good reasons that I listed out. Some of them better than others, but they're all good. I just want to bring other concerns to the radar. And so if you kind of like compare it like this, on the one hand, we should be scandalized by the prospect of baptizing somebody that's not a Christian. Baptists should be scandalized by that. We should say like, oh no, I don't want to do that. So that's a
Mhm.
danger. We want that to be like a red light warning, danger on our radar. But a warning that's also not really on the radar of a lot of Baptist churches is depriving the means of grace, specifically the means of grace of baptism, the Lord's Supper, and church membership, depriving those things from an actual Christian, right? If I just kind of give the
Right.
scenario without giving any of the details of age, if I just give you the scenario and I say, there's a person named Jonah, and Jonah just became, this is more fitting actually. There's a person named Henry, and Henry just became a Christian. And the people nearest him recognize there's fruit of conversion, real fruit of conversion. And he's a Christian, but he's going to have to wait years before getting access to the Lord's Supper, before being baptized, before participating in the warp and woof of church membership, all of those things, because of a external reality of his, an objective reality of his that he has no control over, but the community of faith that he wants to join won't let him because of something that he has no control over. But he's a true Christian. He's truly been bound
Mhm.
in heaven,
Yeah.
and people nearest him who are in the best position to kind of recognize these things say there's real fruit of conversion there, and he wants to participate in these things, but he's being deprived of them for years because he's basically not welcome. Well, before, if I don't give any of the details, I just give you that scenario, Baptists should say that's horrible. You know, um, Henry needs the
Right.
ordinary means of
Right.
grace. Like those are things that it's not just kind of this is a response. This is an outward sign of an inward reality. It is that, but it's also more than that. It's especially if you're coming from a reformed background, you recognize that the means of grace. We call these things the ordinary means of grace because they are things that we believe God has promised through his word to use to sanctify us. These are the things that we need to grow our faith, to give us assurance when we're feeling lack of assurance of salvation. As a Christian who's baptized into a church, I revel in my access to the Lord's Supper, because every time I get access to the Lord's Supper, what's being communicated by my continual access to the Lord's Supper is that I'm still in good standing at this church, so that when I'm beginning to doubt, if I have moments of lack of assurance of salvation, I have the testimony of the church welcoming me to the Lord's Supper. And Christ is meeting with me there in the meal of the Lord's Supper, and my faith is being strengthened. Um, those are means of grace to sanctify us on our journey to the New Jerusalem, uh, but they're ordinary. They are the means of grace that God intends for the whole church to basically have access to. And so I just think, while we should be scandalized by the prospect of prematurely giving those things to somebody that the Spirit does not intend to have. Jesus does not intend for this person to have access to the Lord's Supper. That should scandalize us. It should also scandalize us, the prospect of withholding the things that Jesus
Mhm.
intends for a Christian to have to sanctify them on their journey of faith for potentially, up to decades or more. Um, Yeah. So it's just not wanting to unsay anything that we've said up until this point, but also just say this is also a concern. Let's just put this on the radar. If this is not a category that we're thinking about, maybe we should start thinking about it because uh, while we don't want to give false assurance or prematurely baptize somebody, um, we also don't want to say no to what the Holy Spirit has said yes to.
The concern is that a child would just be doing it because their parents want them to do it, or
Right.
they're just reciting the things they learned in Sunday school or at their Christian school or at the home school. And I remember sitting being like, these are great families who know that they don't want to give false assurance. They know that they've read all the books. They understand, and they've even grown up in a place where that was not taken seriously. They're catechizing their kids. They're teaching them scripture memory. They're they're homeschooling them or Christian, whatever. They're doing Christian education, all these
Yeah.
types of things. They
Yeah.
take them to church. They have them in the service at church. They have them sing. They teach them the Lord's Prayer, all these things. And then when I sit down to interview them, they're penalized for that catechism
Mm.
because it's got to be their own.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like the fact that they're just like, yeah, I believe. I've always believed. I love Jesus. And I'm like, but you had a drug phase, right? I need to know that you've changed, and
Right.
I'm being hyperbolic, but that was kind of an odd moment where I'm like, yeah, that seems like weird. I'm penalizing them, and if there's a genuine desire, and a big part is, I mean, you mentioned it. It's like, in some respect, the parents are the ones who know the best.
Right.
Their heart. Can parents be self-deceived? Of course they can, and that needs wisdom and discernment. But just discounting it, it almost feels like because the parents want it so bad, you're like, well, that you want it too much, so maybe we need to be more cautious.
Right.
And I do wonder if that breeds a sense of, I do wonder, it's like, well, I can't trust my parents' testimony that I'm a Christian. I can't trust my own, and I can't trust all the catechesis I've been given. I've just got to prove it to this room full of people. I mean, I know I'm kind of being a little hyperbolic here,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I've always it's always puzzled me. And so I want to hear what your thoughts in terms of, that's what I was thinking of in terms of legalism, but I want to hear
Yeah.
what your concerns are in
Yeah.
that regard.
Well, I mean, I think you're right that tends to be. I mean, it's frankly, it's encouraging to hear you even say that because the challenges that I have received from some of my friends on that maybe don't agree with me on this particular issue has been basically that's when I kind of depict. Sometimes there's an ethos in a Baptist world to kind of look with suspicion on childhood piety. The response that I've gotten a lot is this is a straw man. Nobody actually does this. Nobody actually, strikes this kind of tone in Baptistic churches. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that there are times when I feel like, am I going crazy? Because it seems to me like this actually is an ethos in our Baptistic churches. And so it's good even to hear that kind of confirmation. But no, I mean, I do think that sometimes there's a different kind of attitude towards the profession of faith of an adult versus the profession of faith of a kid. And it's not just that it's like caution given the limitations of age. It's very often kind of translated into, and I'm thinking of specific conversations I've had, um, very often translated into a cynicism of, and so basically the attitude that
Mm,
is kind of given to
yeah.
an adult convert is amazing, praise God, and maybe if there is caution, it's like, let's read
Right.
through this book and let's, talk about it. In general, there's a great encouragement towards
Yeah.
that. But the
Right.
attitude towards kids very often is a dismissive, like, okay, we'll see, kiddo, like, or even, best case scenario, I hope you're right,
Hmm.
um, so
Right.
that can produce a number of unhelpful responses for the kid. And I'm thinking, a couple of the different kinds of responses. On the one hand, it can cause them to be very despairing because here they hear their pastor from the pulpit give the free gospel call, and the gospel is generous. Jesus is generous. He
Right.
says, "Come to me, all who are weak and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." And here I am saying, okay, if Jesus has given this generous, open invitation, and I'm saying I want to accept the invitation, but I'm kind of being rebuffed in my desire to accept this invitation, is there something wrong with me? Like,
Yeah.
so that's the kind of despair response. but the other response would be something like legalism, to sort of say, okay, I guess for me, because I'm growing up in a Christian household, I there's a different criteria for me to enter into the household of God than there would be if I had some kind of rebellious phase. And so the way that I can enter into the household of God is by really, really proving it that I'm a Christian. So it
Yeah.
can breed this kind of legalism. And then the last kind of unhelpful response that I think it could potentially breed is a diminished view, and this is ironic, but a diminished view of the Lord's Supper and baptism and communion. And this would be like the
Hmm.
best case scenario, where the person, the child basically
Right.
comes to a point where they recognize, I am truly a Christian. I don't doubt that at all. I and I'm growing in my faith, and I guess I don't need baptism and communion and the Lord's Supper, because here I am for years
Right.
now.
Yes.
I've been growing in my
Yes.
faith without having access to these things, so maybe these things are optional. And yeah, I think all of those are unhelpful. I so I wonder. Let me read. Let me just read this little quote from Spurgeon. I have this in the article. I think
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a marvelous quote, and then
Yeah.
and then you can ask whatever follow up question you have. I did have a friend challenge me to basically say, hey, from now on, anytime you read this article from Spurgeon, you need to note that Spurgeon himself didn't baptize his sons until they were young adults. So fair enough. The Spurgeon household, the kids in the Spurgeon household
Hmm.
didn't get baptized until they were young adults.
Yeah.
Um, Still, he did say this. So this is what he says in a book on, basically, that he wrote to the Sunday school teachers in his church. He says, I hope it is not quite so common as it used to be, but I used to see in certain quarters among old folks a deep suspicion of youthful piety. The seniors shook their heads at the idea of receiving children into the church. Some even ventured to speak of converts as, quote unquote, only a lot of girls and boys, as if they were the worst for that. Many, if they hear of a child convert, sharpen their axes to have a cut at him by way of examination. He must know all the doctrines, certainly, and he must be supernaturally grave. It is not every grown-up person who knows the higher doctrines of the word, but if the young person should not know them, he is set aside. Some people expect almost infinite wisdom in a child before they can believe him to be the subject of divine grace. This is monstrous. Then again, if a believing child should act like a child, some of the fathers of the last generation judged that he could not be converted, as if conversion to Christ added 20 years to our age. Of course, the young convert must not play anymore, nor talk in his own childish fashion, or the seniors would be shocked. For it was a sort of understood thing that as soon as ever a child was converted, he was to turn into an old man. Now, if any of you still have an idea in your head hostile to the conversion of children, try and get rid of it, for it is as wrong can be. Learn from the Master's words that you are not to try and make the child like yourself, but you are to be transformed till you yourself are like the child. So there's typical Spurgeon fire
That's a
coming
great
there.
quote. That's a great quote. Yeah. Well, gosh, I mean, I'm just thinking even through the idea of when you said it's devaluing the Lord's Supper, it's devaluing the sacraments, and I'm even thinking how if this can actually, and I've seen this happen where baptism is no longer the sacrament of faith and
Yeah,
conversion;
right?
it's the sacrament of rededication or
Hmm.
really meaning it this time. And you see
Yeah,
that. I mean, the trope is like the multiple baptisms and the multiple rededications, and then that shift where it becomes a sacrament of rededication versus conversion, because I think there's been so much rhetoric about fear of just easy believism, baptizing whoever wants to get baptized, all that stuff. That's almost an overreaction.
yeah,
But I mean, with our Paedo Baptist brothers and sisters and friends, one big critique is, okay, you want to baptize regenerate, and I think they'd even be happy to see that you're willing to baptize children. How do you determine regeneration? I mean, that's always the question.
sure,
How do you have a regeneration, scanner? And it seems especially difficult for a child to determine whether they have a genuine heart change.
totally.
How would you respond to that
Yeah,
critique?
yeah. I mean, that is a not an easy sort of thing to answer. We have, I think, the thing that I agree with my more, um, I don't know, conservative or not conservative. I'm very conservative, but maybe more reserved on who's going to be baptized. The more hesitant to baptize children, that crowd. I have way more in common with that group of Baptist churches than I do virtually any other Christian in the tradition. The 9 marks of a healthy church kind of crowd. Those are my people. I'm in that world. Um, and the thing that we agree on is that we want to keep a tight connection between regeneration, faith, water baptism. So, regeneration and faith, that's spirit baptism. The Spirit baptizes us into the body of Christ. That's signified by water baptism. So, regeneration, faith, water baptism into church membership, and therefore having access to the Lord's Supper. Baptism is the front door into the home. The Lord's Supper is the table that we come around for family meal and family fellowship. Church discipline is the back door when we're
Hmm.
sort of kicked out of the
Yeah.
kicked out of the house. So we all agree on those things. And we also agree further that kids can be converted, that kids can become regenerate, and that they can have faith. And so, where I'm coming from, it's a very simple theological argument to say, because of that, because of those two things that we agree on the one hand, the relationship between
Yeah.
regeneration, faith, baptism, Lord's Supper, church membership, and on the other hand, God can actually convert children. I simply say, let's have a category for baptizing children into the church, because for my friends that disagree with me on this, they are basically putting a separation of potentially years in that whole process that we are agreed conceptually we want to keep these things tightly wove together. So, but then, yeah, the next question is, well, what constitutes as a credible profession of faith for a kid? And again, it's not an easy sort of answer. It's not formulaic, but it's not formulaic for adults either. It's admittedly easier for us to kind of get to
Right.
an agreed upon consensus, but we always recognize that, sometimes you might have a person that says all the right things, but it doesn't really seem like they're a true believer. And so maybe we don't baptize them, or vice versa. We have somebody and it's like, well, their doctrinal, T's are not crossed and their doctrinal I's are not dotted, but we think they're true Christians. So this is a discipleship issue and not a lack of regeneration issue. So we're going to baptize them into church membership, and we're going to disciple them into theological maturity. So we recognize that it's not formulaic for adults, and therefore I think it shouldn't be formulaic for kids either. So then the criteria becomes a lot more careful, getting parents involved. And frankly, I alluded to this earlier, but the church needs to be discipled in this. That before a church can get in the practice of start baptizing kids into church membership, um, I think I think the church needs to be on board with that kind of thing, and they need to know what to be looking for, what kinds of questions to be asking the parents, what kinds of questions to be asking the kids. The pastors should be involved in the interview process with the kids, just like they're involved with the interview process with adults, with a awareness of the fact that there are different maturity levels. In the same way that I don't think that we would want
Right.
to withhold baptism from somebody who maybe has like a mental handicap or something like that. We don't want to withhold baptism from that person because they can't articulate the
Right.
gospel in the same way. So all of these things, there's a spectrum of theological maturity, and all of those things. But what we're after is a credible profession of faith. And if we don't even have a category for what a credible profession of faith looks like for a kid, then we're going to not be inclined to actually introduce that practice of baptizing, smaller children into church membership. Um, but yeah, if you do, then you have all sorts of other questions that you have to answer, like what does church membership actually look like for a 9-year-old? What does it look like for a 9-year-old to vote? And I think in that
Right.
kind of scenario, I'm imagining that the parents are still the primary disciplers of their kids, and they're making judgment calls on what kinds of, if you're sort of announcing ahead of time, hey, this membership meeting is going to have some very um, sensitive materials. Maybe it's somebody's being disciplined because of sexual immorality or something like that, that the parents deem is not ready for their kids to kind of handle. Then, as the primary disciplers of their kids, they kind of make that judgment call. And then conversely, that if I'm imagining the kind of conversations that you have in that household that I would have with a brand new, uneducated baby Christian, adult Christian,
Mm.
which is something like,
Right.
hey, Sam,
Right.
what should I vote for? Hey, this new pastor is coming in. Should I affirm them? And why should I affirm them? What are the reasons why I should
Hmm.
affirm them? And then I would just unabashedly say, I'm going to say yes. I recommend that you say yes. I recommend that you do vote them in for these reasons. And then so all of that is a discipleship
Right.
experience. It's the
Yeah.
warp and woof of church membership that is itself discipling. And that, let me just say one more thing before you jump in.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the natural theology argument that I mentioned at the very beginning um, of this conversation, it's worth bringing in here to kind of highlight maybe where the real difference is between my position and the position that would be more hesitant to church to baptizing kids. And that is, do we think that church membership fits into the category that is analogous to something like uh, military conscription, the responsibility to vote, being able to drive, getting a driver's license, that sort of thing? Is it analogous to entering into a adult phase of life with adult responsibilities in place? Or should church membership be something more like uh, growing up, like where if you're growing up as a kid, you're still subject to all of the same laws and those kinds of things, but you have different levels of responsibility as you grow. As a kid, you're still subject to the law, but um, you can't break the law in certain ways until you reach a certain age, and if you do, the infractions are different, and all of those things because. And there's some things that apply to kids and adults in the same category all the time,
Mm.
but it looks different depending on the different phase of life that you're in, right? So things like friendship and love and being respectful to one another. That's something that I have to do with people in my
Right.
family, and my sons have to do with their uh, with the people in their family. But it looks different. Exercising those responsibilities, living up to those responsibilities look different when you're in a different season of life. So the question is church membership more akin to entering into a new phase of life where all of a sudden a bunch of new responsibilities are just, it's a burden of new responsibility that falls on your shoulders? Or is it more like growing up in a household where different levels of maturity bring new levels of responsibility? And I would say, and this is just where the difference is. The people who are going to say, don't baptize kids until they're ready to kind of come up from under the authority of their parents to kind of live as their own, they're going to say that it's the former.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm going to say the latter. And I would say that it seems to me like the primary metaphor in the Bible for the church is the household of God. We're to relate to one another as brothers and sisters. Paul is, when he writes to these various churches in the Roman Empire, he gives instructions. In Ephesians and Colossians, for example, he's giving instructions to the kids. He's assuming that they're there to hear the letter and that they're part of the community of the church and all of those things. So I would just say, given the fact that household is this major metaphor in the Bible, it seems to me like that should inform the way that we conceptualize church membership. And in a household, you have different levels of responsibility associated with different levels of maturity. So me and my kids, and we all have responsibilities to one another, but the responsibilities grow as you grow. As you grow in age and as you grow in maturity, the responsibilities grow as well. They grow with your age. And so it seems to me like it would be fitting for the church to mirror that in some sense, if it is the household of God. Namely, you have different people with different levels of maturity, and they are growing up into their more mature responsibilities as they grow up in their maturity. Now, my Paedo Baptist, and Presbyterian friends will listen to that and say, "Well, yes, therefore, you should." Baptize infant. The moment that a child is born into
Yeah.
your household, they should be brought into the household of God. And I would simply say, this is the big difference. But I would say, yes, a person, the moment a person is born again, they should be brought into the household of God.
So I'm curious, just on a practical level, how would you help pastors discern whether a child is ready to get baptized? I mean, how even should we? You don't have to give. I guess the questions will vary depending on the family, depending on the child, depending on the age. But what are some helpful ways to think about, even just as pastors, how do you categorize or think about baptizing, a believing child or a child that you think is a believer, and what kind of questions you want to ask?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so in addition to the kinds of questions that you would want to ask the parents even ahead of time or afterwards, like why do you think that, little Jimmy is a Christian? Tell me their story. Um, you basically want to discern from the kid certain things like their recognition of their need for Christ as a savior to save them from their sins, um, their desire to receive the generosity that he offers, um, firstly for the forgiveness of their sins, like a felt sense of I am actually in need of salvation. The forgiveness of sins is not something that bad people out there need, but I need it because I have recognized the sickness of my own heart and the depths of my own sin, if even just in a very childlike manner. So I think, yeah, I mean, just that kind of basic recognition of I'm a sinner. I need Jesus to save me from my sins. He tells me that if I come to him, he'll have me and he'll forgive me of my sins, and I want to get in on that. I want to be in on that, sort of promise. Um, so yeah, I think those are the same kinds of questions that you're going to ask for an adult, but just kind of have the self awareness of the fact that a kid is going to answer this question differently, but you can still discern the same kinds of things, the same kinds of truths that are present for a child that's believing in the gospel for the salvation of their souls versus an adult doing the same. I also so somebody pointed this out to me, but the funeral test. This is something that I mentioned in the article. The funeral test is basically something like this. If you could preach a person's funeral and you could offer the encouragement at the funeral that the person that you're talking about is almost certainly in heaven on account of their profession of faith and the fruit of their life, then such a person is baptism eligible, I think, is a general rule of thumb. If this
Hmm.
person were to die tomorrow, could I tell the people at the funeral, this person, I believe in the bottom of my soul that they're a Christian, and this is the proof. I'm going to point to sort of fruit of salvation in their life, credible faith that I've witnessed and that I've heard from family members and all of those things. I think that's a good kind of very practical litmus test for who we should be baptizing.
This is a fantastic conversation. Have you read Vern Poythress, who's a Paedobaptist? He actually wrote about baptizing children, and he saw that as a very positive development. Of course, he's Paedobaptist, but he saw that as sort of Baptists making progress in correcting some of the things that Paedobaptists view as wrong that aren't necessarily tied to Paedobaptism, but a view
Right.
of children and faith and baptism that is commonly associated with credo baptism, but not necessarily so. And I think what you're doing is very helpful in that regard, because I even think just on a sociological level, this is going to help people see that there is a credo Baptist vision of the household, vision of the
Mhm.
family, that in a sense pedo baptism isn't the only game in town. And I think I think there is something beautiful about, as opposed to infant baptism, where a child can experience baptism. I think Gavin Ortland makes this point, where they can actually experience that sacrament and have a memory of it. And it's not tied to an overly rigorous methodology where it is grace, it is kindness, it is God's patience and love and mercy that goes first. And it's also consciously remembered by them as a pivotal moment. I think that's a powerful thing. Sam, thank you so much for doing this conversation. I'm going to put a link to your article. I suggest everybody who's interested in this, check that out. I think it's, even if you don't agree with all of it, I think it does provoke a lot of thought. And I think this could be, a helpful way to further strengthen the practice of baptism in the local church and understanding of what it means to be part of a local church. And so, Samuel, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Perfect. Yeah, praise God. Thanks for having me on, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please support the show and consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can find all the links to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account in the show notes. Thank you guys for joining us.